Yeah.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's Potatoes in Canada webinar. I'm Stephanie Crowley, the editor of Potatoes in Canada magazine, and I'll be your moderator for this session. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Greentronics, for their support in making this webinar possible. Our speaker today is Christine Noronha, a research scientist at the Charlottetown Research and Development Center in Prince Edward Island. Christine did her PhD at McGill University and postdoc at Laval University in Quebec. She began working for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Alberta and moved to Prince Edward Island in 2000. Christine has been studying wireworms since 2004, and during today's webinar, she will discuss her latest project, the Noronha Elaterid Light Trap. This presentation will be approximately 45 minutes with a question and answer period at the end. At any time during the webinar, please feel free to ask questions through the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will address as many questions as possible after the presentation. If we run out of time during the Q&A, please be assured that we will follow up with you after the webinar. After today's webinar, all registered attendees will be emailed the link to the recorded version of the presentation that you can watch again on demand. With that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Christine Noronha.
Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome everyone. Today I'm going to share with you a new method for wireworm control that we developed here at the Charlottetown Research Center. Before I go into more details about the control method, I would like to share with you an overview of about wireworms, the type of damage they do, their life cycle, current control options, and to demonstrate why they are among the top pests to watch for. So I'll start with what are wireworms. So wireworms are the larvae of click beetles, and on your right-hand side you can see the click beetles and the larva. There are several species that can cause damage to various different crops. They are an emerging pest worldwide, and we have received a lot of information from various places where they have found that the populations are increasing. They affect a wide variety of crops, and some of the crops that they can damage are potatoes. You have this is a corn plant. You have cranberry. Cranberry is an oilseed crop, so you can see them on the cranberry plant here, and you have carrots. These are just a few of the crops that they can damage. They are very damaging to root crops because any damage that they cause can cause the crop to be unmarketable. And in addition, they have a very limited means of control. So some of the damage that they cause here, I have some pictures of the damage. You have a cabbage plant here. This is a transplant, and as you can see, there's so many wireworms feeding on this transplant. And just below this picture, you have a field, this same field, where in this row there should have been actually cabbage transplants. But instead of the cabbage transplants, you have nothing because the wireworms actually ate the cabbage. This grower had to go in and replant his entire field because of the damage. And generally what he does is he plants about 20 to 30% more than what he would need to fulfill his contract. This is a corn plant here, and as you can see the field below, it has these misses in here are not because of a planting error. It is actually because the wireworms ate the plants. So as a result, this farmer actually had to go down and plow down his entire field. You have a cranberry plant. As I had mentioned, cranberry is an oilseed crop. You have here like big patches of this field that the wireworms had eaten the cranberry. You have damage to root crops such as carrots. You can see the little holes that the wireworms make in the carrots. And you have onions. You can see the holes in the onions. I've heard of them doing damage to garlic as well. And you have potatoes, another root crop where they have done quite a bit of damage. Looks like a pincushion, this potato here. In addition to those crops, they also eat barley seeds and barley and wheat. And here you have a field that is just starting to see damage. So populations are just starting to build up. And usually in a field where the populations are just starting, you have these patches. You can see these patches in the field. And eventually these patches will grow as the wireworms grow and as their population increases. And as populations increase, this is what you end up with. You can have an entire field eaten by wireworms and absolutely no crop. This is a wheat field in Alberta. So you can see that they can do a tremendous amount of damage to crops. The life cycle of wireworms, there are many different species, and the life cycle can range anywhere from 2 years to 5 years. Generally what happens is that the adults come out in the spring and they will start laying their eggs. They lay between 100 and 200 eggs. The larvae hatch and they will start feeding on the seeds and the roots of newly planted seedlings. They'll feed all throughout the summer and on these roots, and then in the fall they will start feeding on the root crops such as potatoes and carrots and rutabagas. Usually, like most insects, the wireworms will feed quite voraciously in the fall, and this is mainly so that they can develop can build fat in their bodies so that they can hibernate for the winter and survive the long hibernation period. So they will feed, and that's when they do a lot of damage because they're feeding so much. And once they have fed, they're ready to hibernate in late fall. They will go down deep into the soil and hibernate there. Then in the spring, they would come back up and start feeding on the newly planted seeds and seedlings. Now this cycle will continue depending on the species. It will continue for 2 to 5 years. After that, when the larvae are mature, they will pupate and they would they would pupate and then they will emerge again in the spring to as click beetles, and they will start the cycle again. So depending on which species you're dealing with, these larvae can live in the field anywhere from 2 years to 5 years. So the click beetle species that are pests in Canada, there are approximately 30 species that are pests of various crops. Each region in Canada has its own unique species complex. The species that we are interested in are these European species. They are Agriotis putata, Agriotis obscurus, and Agriotis lineatus. These are 3 European species. All 3 species are present in Prince Edward Island. Sputata is present in Nova Scotia, and it's also been reported from New Brunswick. Obscurus and lineatus are present in Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland, and also in British Columbia. Now, in other regions of the country, there are different species that are just as damaging as these, but we are interested in these ones because they are causing the most damage. In Prince Edward Island, it's Agriotis putata, which has basically taken over most of our fields and is causing a lot of damage here. We do find other species, Hypnoides, Tenistra species, Tilopius, Limonius, Melanotus. So in addition to Sputata and Obscurus and Lineatus, we also find a lot of these other species. And sometimes you have a mix of different species in a single field. So how do wireworms attack, and why do they attack germinating seeds? When you plant a seed in the spring, as the seed grows, it starts to produce carbon dioxide, and the wireworms that are hibernating, they sense the carbon dioxide, and they start to move up and come in contact with your seed, and they feed on the seed. So those are the corn seeds that you plant, the corn, the wheat, all those seeds, they will go and attack them in the spring. There is another aspect of this insect which compounds the problem, is its relationship with plowed down green material. And what happens is if you plow down green material in your fields, and then say you go and plant, in this case I'm taking an example of a root crop, potatoes. So if you plant your potato seed piece, and in the case of potatoes, we also have an insecticide that is registered. So you put down your potatoes there, and you have this green material here. The wireworms, when they come out of hibernation, they will stop at this level because they encounter food. This is food for them. So they will encounter this food and they will stay there. Some of them will get up to this level, but a lot of them stay in this area. So by mid-September, all this green material has deteriorated and is gone. And also at that time, in the fall, your tubers are starting to develop. And as your tubers are developing, the wireworms also need to feed. It's late fall now, your tubers are there, your daughter tubers, they are going to come up now because there's no food left here at the bottom for them to be attracted to. So they're going to move up to your tubers, and they're going to start feeding on your tubers. So this compounds their impact, because a lot of growers will plow their fields down in order to, as green manure, in order to increase the organic matter in their soils. So this would become an issue if you have wireworms in your field. So moving on to why are they difficult to control. One of the aspects is this long life cycle. Once you have wireworms in your field, if their eggs are laid, they're going to be there for 5 years. The larvae are going to be living in your field for 5 years. The long life cycle also makes it very difficult to do research, because if you need wireworms, you have to go out to the field to collect them, because you don't have them in your you cannot grow them in your lab because it's just too long. The life cycle is too long. They're also soil dwelling, which makes it very difficult because you cannot see them. You don't know where in the soil profile they actually are, so that you can target them. And that's another issue which makes it very difficult for us to find control measures for them. Another aspect is that they have an aggregated distribution in the field. So if you go to monitor, and usually you monitor fields by using a bait trap, and if your bait trap is placed in an area in the field where there are no wireworms, they are in a different section of the field, you may think that your field does not have a wireworm problem, but actually it does, because you didn't put any traps in this area where they were aggregated. So really the bottom line is, if you have if you are in an area where your neighbors all have a wireworm problem and you put baits out in your field and you don't find any wireworms, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have wireworms. Because of this aggregated distribution, you have to put a large number of baits out in your field in order to know for sure if you have wireworms or not. The other factor is if you put your baits out too early in the spring or too late in the fall, they have already, either in the spring they haven't come up to the surface yet. Depending on the temperature, they move when the soil temperature becomes 10 degrees, and if you want to plant early, you put your baits out early, you run into that problem of not having wireworms in your bait. In the fall, if you put it out too late, they've already gone down into the soil to hibernate, so you won't have wireworms. So these issues make it really difficult to monitor this pest. There are several generations in a field. What I mean by this is you can't always have, every year you have beetles coming in and laying their eggs. And because you have, the wireworms live for 5 years, so you may have larvae that were laid last year, larvae that were laid this year, hatching this year, larvae that hatched last year, larvae that hatched the year before. So you have several generations in your field. Damage occurs in the spring and the fall. And this is important because unlike other insects where you get them, like potato beetles, they come in the spring, they will feed on your potato crop in the spring. They lay their eggs and then they'll start feeding. This insect will feed on your crop in the spring, where it's feeding on all the newly planted seeds, and then in the fall it affects your root crops. So it makes it really difficult to determine what crop are you going to plant in your field if you have a wireworm infested field. They feed on a wide variety of crops. So another aspect that makes it difficult to determine which crop are you going to plant in a wireworm infested field. As you can see, there are many crops that they feed on. There are very few efficacious insecticides, and the reason is that there's a lot of older insecticides that were registered that have been deregistered now. They've been taken off the market, and as a result you have very few insecticides that are actually available to control this insect. So this insect has really forced us to look at pest management, actual management of this insect. And we really need to bring in the integrated into this pest management strategy. And we use integrated in a very loose sense a lot of times in IPM strategies, where we look at monitoring and applying a control product. Whereas in this case, I think that works, but it's not the only option. We need to look at the bigger picture. We need to look at really integrating other strategies. But in order to do that, we need several strategies in our management box for growers to use. And that's the whole thrust of of the research that we are doing, is to look to study different strategies, and so that the growers have available to them many different strategies that they can use. So for insecticides, the insecticides that are available for control, and this is only for potatoes, because carrots, rutabagas, cabbage, all these crops don't have insecticides available to them to use. We have, for potatoes, you have Thimet, you have Titan, you have Capture. These all work against wireworms. We are continuing to do research and evaluate other insecticides, insecticide combinations, and also other ways to get the insecticide to these wireworms. A factor that comes into play with wireworms is that some of the insecticides work against some species and they don't work against other species. So that's also another aspect that plays a role in wireworm control. We know that the plow down affects, if you plow down green material, increases damage to your crops. So one of the strategies that we are promoting to our growers is to restrict plow down of green material in wireworm infested fields. That's one of the strategies that they can implement in their farming practice. Another strategy that they are using, and our growers here are using, is to use the brown mustard and buckwheat as rotation crops. They are using it, they're getting good results, so they are incorporating that into their farming practice. So these are strategies that are available to them right now. We are also working on, my colleagues working on looking at biological control strategies, where we're looking at metarhizium to control wireworms. And although that is not available right now, but we hope to have it as one of the tools in our management toolbox. So for now, we have focused most of our research and our development of our strategies on wireworms. But what about the click beetles? We want to look at them as well. They're very tiny, so it's really difficult to see them on the ground, and they walk on the soil surface. And that's where they lay their eggs in little crevices in the soil. So we wanted to focus on them to see what's happening. How can we actually control the click beetles? And my colleagues are working on this, but I was looking at it from a totally another perspective, is how can we reduce the egg laying? Is there a way that we could reduce egg laying in these fields? So the first question was, where do they actually prefer to lay their eggs? And what we found is they like to lay their eggs in undisturbed fields with green plant material, such as sod fields, under-seeded fields. Growers here like to grow barley, seed barley, and underseed it with clover, so that when they take off their barley, there's the clover there that they can plow down as green material to increase the organic matter in their soil. But unfortunately, wireworms eggs survive better in this condition because they have a lot of food available to them. The young hatching larvae have food. Pasture fields are an area where populations tend to build up quite a lot in these pasture fields, and then they move into the crop fields. And we have also found that the adults will lay their eggs in bare soil. Now, if they lay their eggs in bare soil, they are susceptible to desiccation. However, in our climate here in Atlantic Canada, it's very rare that it gets really dry in the spring when the eggs are being laid and the eggs hatch. So it's not something that's going to happen as frequently. So when we were thinking about this whole project and what we were going to do, we said, well, is there a way to stop them from laying eggs? And the only way to do that was to trap the females. Now, until now, we could trap males because we had pheromone traps, and pheromones attract males, so we could attract the males, and those are really tell us what species you have in your field. And pheromones are only available for the 3 European species. So we had the pheromone trap, so there was no way of trapping large numbers of females. So we wanted to develop a trap, but we wanted that trap to be an easy trap that could easily be used in fields. It could be installed in a 100-acre field or a 200-acre field. It didn't matter. That's what we were trying to figure out what we could do to build a trap that could actually be used. And we wanted a trap that could be used in pasture fields around animals, because as I mentioned earlier, pasture fields are where the populations build up. And then once they build up to a certain carrying capacity, the adults come out and they start to fly into your crop fields. And that's what we are seeing here on the island. The species that we are dealing with is a very good flyer, and it flies into houses. Now the populations are really high, so it's flying into houses, into people's gardens, and now they're having problems in home gardens as well. So we wanted something to a trap that could be used in these pasture fields to decrease the population at the same time as decreasing the population in your field, so that you'd stop the seed population from growing. So what we came up with, 3 simple components to our trap. There's a solar-powered spotlight. We wanted a solar-powered light because in a 80-acre field, you're not going to drag a generator or batteries and then you have to change it. So we want something that was very simple and easy for growers to use. So this was a solar-powered spotlight. It's just a plain old garden spotlight. We had these cups. It's good to have a cup which has the inside of the cup should be white so that it can reflect the light. And the third component is a cage that we used, in a chicken wire cage. And we put these 3 components together to come up with a trap which is called the NELT. The light is the cup is placed in the ground and the light shines in the cup, and here you can see this is what the trap looks like, and once it's buried in the ground you can see what it looks like in the ground. The light basically shines in inside the cup, and the beetles are attracted to the light and they come towards it and they fall into the cup. So the cup is like a pitfall trap. The cage that we put is mainly to stop other insects from going in there, and to even stop mice and voles and slugs from falling in there. So we put the cage in, and we didn't want the predatory beetles, the carabid beetles, from going in, because we don't want to decrease the carabid beetle populations in your field. So that's the reason for the cage, is mainly to decrease your entry of other organisms into the pitfall trap. The trap is actually the pitfall. The cup is filled with water with a couple of drops of dish soap in it, and that dish soap will break the surface tension of the water, so when the beetles fall in, they actually drown in there. And the trap would need to be checked once a week to make sure that the water is there and there's enough water and soap in the trap. So this is what the trap looks like at night. This is the pitfall trap, and the light shines in the cup. You can see that if you have a white cup, it's not translucent. It should be white. It actually reflects the light, so it's a lot brighter. And we have a couple of pictures here where you can see this is with the cage, and this is what the trap looked like in our field. It's very interesting going to the field in the middle of the night. Actually, one of the growers came to the field wondering who is in my field in the middle of the night. So it was kind of interesting. This is what the traps looked like in the field. and we had our study was conducted in 2 fields. We brought these traps, the beetles. We were catching live beetles. We didn't kill them, so we brought them back to the lab. We counted them, and then we put them into these containers, and we gave them some food, and the food included a dental wick, cotton wick with honey solution, and also apples for them to feed on. And you can see how they just go straight for the apple and the honey solution, and they feed on that. So we kept them, we counted them, and then we put them in these containers until the next day, where we could start to sex them, because they have to be sexed under the microscope. And we were catching a lot of beetles, so we had to keep them happy for a few days until we sexed them. So our methods that we used were, we had 10 light traps, and in field 1 we had 10 light traps and 10 non-light traps. The traps were placed about 15 feet apart from each other, and the no-light traps were placed like 30 feet away. So that's how we placed our traps in the field. The cages were used again once to reduce the predatory beetles from falling into the traps. We had a second field where we used the 5 traps, 5 light and 5 no light traps. The no light traps were just pitfall traps without the light source. That's all. And we collected every 2 days, because we wanted to sex the beetles, and we wanted to keep on top of it. So we had them every 2 days. We were collecting from May 19th to August 25th. And we held them in the lab, as I had mentioned, and then we sexed them, identified and sexed them. So what did we find? We were very surprised. We found 4 different species, actually 5, but the other one was in very low numbers. Sputata made up our main insect in our traps. We found Hypnoides abbreviatus, Tinisra, and Sylvanellator. So we found these 3. These 3 species were in very low numbers, and compared to Sputata. And even when we do our bait traps, we find these other species, but very rarely. So the populations in these fields are very, very low. Now I think I know why the populations are low, because in our traps we had Sputata in our containers. When we brought them back to our lab, we would put them together, and this Sputata would actually eat these larger. They would fight and kill these larger beetles. So if there were larger beetles in that container for overnight, the next morning they would be dead. So Sputata can be quite an aggressive species. What did we find? So in field number 1, which was an 8-acre field, we sampled from May 19th to August 25th, and we had a total of 9,362 beetles, compared to the no light trap, which was 3,613. So definitely the light trap attracted a lot more beetles. We found a significant difference between the males that were caught in these traps, 4,570 males and 3,206 females, compared to 1,314. So there was a significant difference in the numbers of males and females that were caught in these light traps as compared to the no light traps. Now you can see here we had some that could not be sexed, and it was because Sputata is an aggressive species, and it feeds on, and they fight, and they will eat each other. So we would be left with only the elytra at the end. So that's why there were some that we could not sex. As you can see here, 98% of the population was Sputata, and we had these other 3 made up the rest of the population. So mainly spotata in our traps. When we look at the number of beetles per trap, there's a significant difference in the number of spotata, mainly males and females, so there's significantly lower numbers in the no light traps as compared to the light traps. So this was in our field, the field number 1. In field number 2, we started late. We started two weeks later when we put our traps out, and we started at June 4th to August 25th is when we collected them. And you can see here once again we had a significantly higher numbers in our light traps as compared to our no light traps. And once again our populations that we were catching were of males and females were significantly higher in our light traps compared to our non-light traps. So this was in field 2, and spotata made up 97% of our population, and the rest was made up by these other 3 species. When we look at the numbers per trap, we only had 5 traps in these fields. We find similar results, you know, like the numbers of spotata. This is just the spotata. We have 879 beetles in our light trap as per trap as compared to 112, and similar with the males and the females. So this significantly higher numbers in our light traps as compared to our no light traps. So we know our light traps are attracting them. We looked at the total number of beetles found per sample day, and in field number 1, where we started on May 19th, you can see that the light trap didn't change the activity period. It's still, you know, when the activity is on, you can see that it's compared to the no light trap, the activity period is approximately the same. You may wonder why this fell from 1,600 beetles to 0, and it was because we needed to remove the traps from the field. The grower wanted to go in there and plant. So for that weekend we couldn't put any traps out, and we went on the 4th and put between here and here. We took the traps out, and then we went back in and put it in on the 4th. So that's the reason why there is that drop in here. And you can see here that you have your really its activity lasts. You're trapping only until the 6th of June. After that, populations drop off. We went right up to August, but really we only needed to go until July 6th, and you can see that here as well in the no light traps. In field number 2, we went later, June 4th, so we missed the beginning of the season. But once again, the activity period was approximately the same in the light versus no light traps. So the light traps are not changing the activity period of these insects. And once again, July, beginning of July is when really the populations start to decrease considerably. So when we do the math of what we found, we have in our trap, each trap got 320 females. So if we got these females before they laid eggs, so one female would lay 100 to 200 eggs, and if we got these females before they started laying their eggs, each female, you would have a reduction of 32,000 to 62,000 eggs. Now, when a female lays all those eggs, not all the eggs survive. So even if half of those eggs survive, for the hatching larvae, you could have 16,000 to 32,000 larvae. Now, these larvae are not going to survive. All of them are not going to survive over the 5-year period, but this is what you're reducing at the very initial stage. So that is if you catch the females before they start laying their eggs. So one trap has the potential to prevent a considerable number of eggs from being laid. And that's the reason why we decided to release this information and tell the farmers, because we want them to go out and put these traps out, because any females you catch now, you are starting to reduce your population, because it'll take several years to reduce the population, the long life cycle, because of the long life cycle. So anything you reduce today, you're not going to see the impact until 5 years later when your population has decreased. So the benefits of using the light trap are, you take out your female beetles, large numbers of female beetles, you reduce your eggs, you're reducing your larval population, and in the end you are reducing your damage. But like I said before, it takes a long time. You'd have to put these traps out in your field every year for 5 years, depending on the species you are dealing with, in order for it to show the impact later on. But it would be one investment for a grower. They would invest in this trap and put it out for 2 months, take it back in. Once you made that investment, you can put these traps out every year. So we've done a lot of changes to our trap. This was the original trap that we used, and then we went and made our first prototype. This is actually a print of our trap, a 3D print. When we made this trap, it's perfect, but we found that the lights change. The size of the lights change, so we had to adapt it. So we made it a little bit bigger to accommodate a larger light. And what we did was, it's bigger and accommodated the larger light, but we also put this little holder. It was in the first design to this holder. So we modified that because we wanted to get the price down a bit. So we took out the cup holder and we put a little notch in here so that you can actually move the light back and forth depending on the size of your light. And it's just got this hole in here where you can drop your cup into it, make a hole in the ground, drop your cup in, and cover everything up with soil, and let it go in the field, place it in the field. So that was the first year of this study, and we need to do a lot more research. So we have a lot of ongoing research right now. We are looking, we want to determine the efficacy of the trap with different click beetle species. So I have sent out traps to British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. So we're trying to see what other species this trap would catch. That's what we're looking for to determine its efficiency. We want to evaluate its potential trapping radius. We don't know how far away can it attract from, and that is important because it will tell us the number of traps that are required per acre. Because right now, as I had mentioned, we have placed our traps 15 feet apart, but we need that distance is probably going to increase. I suspect it's going to increase, but we need to find this out. We also need to find out the efficiency of this trap in different cropping systems, because I suspect we are going to have to adapt this trap a little bit to the different cropping systems. We trapped in a barley field, and even though the barley was growing, we got large numbers of beetles. So we know that it works in the barley, but we want to find out in other cropping systems, because it is going to have to be used on pasture fields and in sod fields and other areas as well. So we are going to continue to do our research in this area to determine the efficiency of this trap under different systems and how many traps per acre, the potential trapping radius, all that needs to be sorted out. I do need to acknowledge my team. they were great. It took a long time to sex those beetles under the microscope, and it was a really big job, and it was a great team. I do want to acknowledge the support from our local industry, from the PEI Department of Agriculture, Potato Board, and Hort Association. It's always good to have support from our local organizations. I can't thank the growers enough that I work with. They are just fantastic. They allow us to come onto their fields. They're very patient with us and do whatever we ask them to do. So we really have great growers here in PEI that work with. And we are in the process right now of finding a commercial partner to mass produce these traps and make them available to farmers. And if you want more information on the commercialization aspects of the NELT, you can visit the technology transfer website, www.flintbox.com. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Christine, for sharing your information with us. We do have a few questions from some of our participants online. So one of the questions posed was, in your graph that you had showed us about the number of click beetles captured, the traps without lights also captured some click beetles. Why do you think this is?
Sorry, could you repeat the last portion? Could you repeat the last sentence?
Sure. So one of the some of your traps, the no light traps, also captured some click beetles. Why do you think that happened?
Oh, the no light traps, actually they are just pitfall traps, and those traps, basically beetles just walking around on the surface searching for food or searching for oviposition sites or searching for mates, just fall in. They are passive traps. So pitfall traps are used for many different insects as passive traps. So they just fall in. It's just I'm walking around and then I just fall into the trap. Okay. So that's why passive traps always catch some insects.
Okay. Is it possible to control the hibernating insects before the overwintering season?
It's kind of difficult. You mean like in the fall, right? When they are feeding in such large numbers, it's kind of difficult because what do you use at that time for the larvae that are feeding? You cannot use an insecticide at that time. If you plant any crop with an insecticide, especially like a grain crop or something like that, you do have birds that come in, our Canada geese that come in and eat the wheat. So you don't want to use anything there. But we are trying to come up with other ways that we can control those worms in the fall when there's large numbers at the surface. So I'm sure we will come up with a way of doing it at some point, and that's one of the directions that we should move in as well.
Okay, great. There's another question here. Connor asks, do you see these traps being used in big ag, and are there possible interferences with existing farm machinery, or with the practices typically found on large acre farms, like for example, canola, wheat, or corn crops?
Oh yeah, I definitely see them being used. Certain fields, they can be, they go in fairly early because the beetles are active from the beginning of May to the end of June. So with our farmers, you can put them along the edge of the field where it won't interfere with your farm machinery, and that's what some of our farmers are testing here. The other thing they're testing is they go in and they plant their grain crop, and usually they don't do anything to their grain crop. They don't have to go in again. So in that case, they can go in and put these traps out into the grain fields, and it won't interfere with the machinery. With potato crop, same idea, you know, it's only after you plant your potato crop that you can actually put these traps in. But you don't put them where you have your spray rows, you know, or where your sprayer is going to go. You can put them in the center of the field somewhere after you plant your potatoes, and they can just sit there and be checked by the scouts that walk through the fields anyway.
Okay. What size mesh is used in the NELT trap?
It's a quarter-inch mesh.
Okay.
It's great for our beetles because the size works well for our beetles that we have here. So I would say, you know, it needs to be looked at in other situations where the size of the click beetles may be different with different species. So that needs to be looked at for different areas in Canada.
Right, right. Do you have some physiological control used elsewhere? I'm assuming for this is just what the question states, I'm assuming for the click beetles, but...
Physiological controls elsewhere? No, I don't, not really. I can't think of anything right now.
Is there any indication whether or not the female beetles have laid eggs before being caught? The question continues, and he says, presumably this varies with how early or how late the beetles fall into the trap. But when do the eggs normally get laid?
That's something that we are actually looking at right now. When do they get laid? We found that they were being laid at the very end of May from the beetles that we collected in our traps, and we brought them in, we sexed them, but we also kept them to see when they're laying their eggs, and we found that they were laying their eggs late in May, and the trap started collecting at the in mid-May. As soon as we put them out, they started collecting the beetles at that time. So you are going to miss some beetles. There may be some eggs laid, but generally I would say that they are catching females before they start laying eggs.
Okay, great. Can you expand a little bit on the research that you're doing in regards to the traps per acre, the number of traps per acre?
Sure. What we are doing now is we have scaled up our trapping system on our research farm, and we're going to do that for a few years to show how we could use a integrated pest management strategy to control, to reduce populations. But for the trap specifically, we are going to release it's a mark release capture trial where we're going to put out these traps in a field and release marked beetles, actually marked beetles at different distances from the trap, and see how many we catch from the different colors, because there'll be different colors at different distances. So we're going to see how many do we catch in our trap, so we'll know what proportion of the population they're catching at the different distances, and that will tell us how far apart these traps need to be effective, and what distance they catch from, and then from that we extrapolate to how many do we need per acre.
Great, thank you. And how long do click beetles live?
They live for one season. So they come out in May, and they'll just lay their eggs, and then they die off.
Okay, I think that about wraps it up for questions from our attendees. I'd just like to send a reminder out that all registered attendees will receive a link to the archive presentation via email. Christina's also graciously allowed us to pass on her contact information, so if you have any other further questions for her, please feel free to contact her directly via email. It's christine.noronha@agr.gc.ca. Thank you again, Christine, for sharing your research with our audience with Potatoes in Canada. And we'd like to thank our sponsor again, Greentronics, Greentronics for making this presentation available. Thank you everyone for participating and attending. That wraps up our webinar, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.